Were your English
From there,
teammates better than your Australian teammates?
no, of course not. And how could I
Good
suggest
answer.
otherwise?
Senator Varun Ghosh, thank you so much for chatting to Indian Link today, and we're really, really excited to be able to have this time to talk a bit about your journey into politics, but also, where to from here, and the vision that you have going forward in this wonderful position that you find yourself in.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Senator, you've had a remarkable career story and a remarkable career trajectory. Can you tell us a bit about how you've landed to find yourself in the position that you are as a senator for WA?
Well, thank you. I've been very fortunate in a number of the opportunities that I've had, both in terms of education and career opportunities, but it really starts earlier than that, and that's from my parents. I was raised with my younger brother, Gareth, in a very loving and secure family home. Education was always seen as being very important. I was very interested at school in political and legal studies and history, and I think both of those things led me down the road of wanting to study law at the University of Western Australia. I also studied political science and international relations, which again, those interests continued to develop. And then when I finished law school, I joined a law firm called Mallisons, Stephen Jakes. It's now called King and Wood Mallisons, which really gave me both excellent fundamental legal training and technical training, but also I met some wonderful friends and mentors along the way. That professional journey led me to want to study overseas. And I was lucky enough to win a scholarship to do my master's in the University of Cambridge. That was a wonderful year where I got to immerse myself in a series of topics that are perhaps not day-to-day topics in the commercial legal world, like legal philosophy and jurisprudence, but also got to play a lot of cricket and hockey and make some wonderful friends and see a large part of England.
Were your English teammates better than your Australian teammates?
No, of course not. And how could I suggest
answer.
otherwise? I played cricket and hockey, so Australia, I think, still has the wood on England in both those sports. But I was also interested in working overseas, and an opportunity came up to work in financial law in New York for a firm called White & Case there. That was a fascinating experience. I landed up there in 2011, which was sort of in the shadows of the global financial crisis, and was working in a transactional team. And that was both incredibly rigorous, and the lawyers in New York worked very long hours, but it was also a fascinating and really stimulating opportunity to live in New York. It's a wonderful city and lots to do as a young man there. All of these steps along the way, I sort of had the real advantage of having the opportunity to get to those places, but then also learning a lot from fantastic people. I then did a stint at the World Bank. That was driven largely because I was interested in public policy and in international policy, and that was based in Washington, DC. But it was always my plan to come back to Australia, not least of which because I love the country, but my family was also here. So I missed them a lot when I was away. So coming back to Australia at the end of 2014, I rejoined legal practice, and then a few years later became a barrister at Francis Burt Chambers in Perth, where, in short, I was able to represent clients in a number of different courts and tribunals. That was incredibly stimulating, and it really is a sort of a wonderful job. It's the job I had immediately before becoming a senator. That's the professional track. And then sort of running alongside that for a long time was my involvement in the Labor Party. I joined the Labor Party when I was 17, basically just before I started university. And I joined at that stage because I believed very strongly in the transformative power of education. And I thought that as a matter of fairly basic fairness, it was important that everyone in society had access to good education and good training opportunities, as a way of then providing a pathway into good jobs that were well paid, were safe, and where their rights were respected. And that, I think, fairly naturally led to the Australian Labor Party. That's the sort of intellectual reason. At that stage, I think I was also fascinated by the Hawke and Keating governments and their reform agenda, the energy of their leadership, and their focus on both really good economic policy, but also Australia being proud of itself, finding its place in our region, and being comfortable as an open, multicultural and liberal society.
Absolutely. Well, no, thank you so much for that, Senator. And I mean, I don't want to spark a diplomatic incident if you're a cricket fan, and don't want to ask you about the Johnny Bairstow incident. You know, if you'll upset some of your English teammates back at Cambridge or anything like that. But I mean, I did want to touch on you. You know, you clearly have an interesting family background, and a lot of people from Australian Indian background can relate to. How important is that heritage for you as someone that's now a senator, and how do you propose to be able to bring that as part of how you represent the community, both the Australian Indian community?
So, as a senator from Western Australia, obviously I represent Western Australians in the Commonwealth Parliament. I think that background, not only in terms of my family's background and their experiences, but also the cultural identity of being an Australian of Indian origin, I think is essential to the perspective I bring to this job. It's certainly something that will infuse everything I do as a result of that. It's a part of who I am, and that experience is very, very near and dear to my heart.
No, brilliant. And look, Senator, I'm curious. You've got both your parents who are doctors. You've got your brother who's a doctor. I don't know if you're like me, perhaps you're the black sheep of the family where you did law. I mean, do you think you're the star child now that you're a senator?
Oh, far from it, far from it. When I was selected by the West Australian Parliament to replace Senator Dodson, the Premier of Western Australia, Roger Cook, after going through my parents' professional background and my brother's professional background, I think described me as the underachiever of the family, and I think that's probably right.
Oh, brilliant. No, some things never change. Look, I'm glad you brought up Senator Dodson. And obviously, your position at the Senate now comes after a remarkable career that Senator Pat Dodson had, a proud and very well-known Indigenous representative. Obviously, we've recently had a referendum where Australia ultimately voted no to form constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians by way of a voice to Parliament. As someone who has, and in your first speech, talked about Senator Pat Dodson's influence, do you see yourself as someone who wants to advocate more for Indigenous issues, given that background as part of the passing on of the torch, I suppose, of a legacy?
That's a wonderful question. Let me take it one step back to begin with, which is to say that obviously the reason that I am in the Senate now is to fill a casual vacancy that was created by Senator Dodson's retirement. And the circumstances of that retirement are obviously marked by sadness because Senator Dodson was unwell for a little while beforehand. And so I think I'm both very conscious of that context as I take this seat and also the enormous responsibility that comes from replacing someone like Senator Dodson in the Senate. I think I said in my first speech that his contribution to Australian life is really immeasurable. And I believe that. I mean, he's been an advocate for justice for First Nations people, but also for rural and regional Australia for his whole life. And that's very much something that's front of mind as I take over this job. In relation to the referendum itself, obviously the result and the defeat of the yes case was a source of some significant disappointment to a large number of Australians, and particularly a number of Indigenous Australians. I think the starting point is you have to acknowledge that a majority of Australians voted against creating a voice to Parliament, and however much I was for a voice to Parliament, but ultimately we as Australians have to respect that result. Where to from here, I think, is a renewed focus on closing the gap initiatives in education, in healthcare, and in economic opportunities for Indigenous Australians. And I think that the government is both focused on that and very conscious of its responsibility to address those issues and to continue to try to improve the position of Indigenous people in our community, which unfortunately in many instances remains one of disadvantage, if not severe disadvantage. I think all Australians have an obligation to try to improve the lot of Indigenous Australians, and obviously Australians of Indian origin form part of that broader group. I'm not sure that there are specific elements that I would see as relating to the Australian Indian community as distinct from the Australian community more generally, but I do think it is very important that we continue to focus on and continue to improve some of those metrics and really close the gap for Indigenous Australians.
I'm curious as to, now that you find yourself in a position as a senator, do you find that a lot of migrants sometimes feel concerned or afraid of actually having a voice or having a political voice, perhaps? How do you combat that? And how do you encourage people of multicultural backgrounds to actually get a bit more involved in politics, or at least having their voices heard to advocate for political issues?
That's a very good question, and it's got a number of layers to it. So I'll sort of address each in turn. In the first instance, I think it's important not to generalise too broadly across groups of people or to talk about multicultural Australia generally, because I think there are lots of different issues and there may be different priorities or different interests that people have that are really individual to them. I do think cultural diversity is important in Australia's parliaments, and I think some of that is already being rectified or is already being improved. You see a lot more people from different backgrounds and different experiences in politics itself, in journalism, in the law. So I think some of that is occurring naturally over time, both as people or groups of people are here in Australia for longer, but also as they feel more comfortable getting involved. In the Indian community, I mean, again, and within the Indian community more generally in Australia, obviously, as you're aware, there, and many of the people listening to this are very aware, there's different cultural and language groups within that and different communities. So I do put that caveat on at the start because I don't want to generalise too intensely, but I think there is a sense of finding economic security first. And then as families are in Australia for longer and longer periods, you'll see that natural broadening of interests and probably a deepening of political engagement as well.
You've had a very big outpouring of support and excitement from the Indian community more broadly as well, ever since, finding yourself in the Senate. And I think that's been a really, really exciting part and something I think you described as being quite overwhelmed by that support. I mean, what has that support been like and what does it mean to you?
Well, look, I really am. I can't express how heartwarming and happy it's made me feel. It's been expressed in lots of different ways, be it at events or people reaching out to me directly or people talking in the media about it. So it's been overwhelming. I feel very fortunate. I feel the warmth of that embrace quite vividly, and I'm very grateful for it. So I do just want to express that as well.
One of the huge things in Australia that I think the diaspora across the country is really proud of is how much the diaspora has done to really push forward that relationship, which we are seeing the fruits of now. So what do you see your role as someone of an Australian-Indian background in, firstly, the strength of that Australian-Indian relationship and moving it forward as well?
Well, so let me touch upon something that you said there, which I think is spot on, which is the strength of the diaspora community. And in early February, when I was very new in this job, there was a conference called the Indian Ocean Conference held in Perth, to which both Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong and the Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar came to, and a number of other Indian Ocean country leaders and foreign ministers were there. And I think both Foreign Minister Wong and Foreign Minister Jaishankar commented on the strength and the contribution that the Indian diaspora has played to Australian society, has played in Australian society, and their importance going forward. It's an interesting question as to what role I will play in that, because obviously I'm a senator from Western Australia, and my primary constitutional responsibility is to represent the people of Western Australia in the Commonwealth Parliament. I think what's very encouraging for me more generally, though, is the breadth and depth of the commitment that people have to the Australia-India relationship, both in India and in Australia. And I think that's reflected not only at a governmental and business level, but also at a personal level. And the communities are excited, I think, by the prospect of closer Australia-India ties.
Absolutely. Look, Senator, now that you have started to hopefully settle into the role as a senator for Western Australia, what would you say your key vision or visions are while you take up this position and for your time in the Senate?
Well, I think as I start out, it's important for me to acknowledge that I've just moved into a job where I'm representing Western Australians in Canberra, and it's one involving a number of very steep learning curves. So at the moment, I'm very much trying to get up those learning curves as quickly as I can so I can be an effective advocate. Looking back, or perhaps in the future, I would hope that people would be able to say that I've made a contribution to making education more accessible to people across Australia, and including in Western Australia. I think that would be one thing that I'd be very grateful if I was able to make a contribution to that. The second is in relation to Western Australia's economy and its place in the broader Australian nation. In my first speech, I did spend some time talking about the significance of Western Australia and the distinctness of its outlook. And I think if I can play any small role in keeping Western Australia economically strong outward-looking and a confident, proud, and vibrant state, then I'd be very happy.
Absolutely. And look, we won't say anything about how the West Coast Eagles and Fremantle Dockers are doing it in the AFL right now, but we wish all Western Australians.
I'm a Dockers fan, so I'm pretty happy to talk about how we're doing.
You're okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. One out of two. That's fair enough. No,
exactly.
But look, Senator, we're so grateful that you've been able to spend some time talking to Indian Link today. We're so excited to see you in the position that you are in, and we wish you all the best for what we hope to be a fruitful and effective political career. Congratulations, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's lovely to speak to you.